G'day, I'm Tricia Reust. I'm excited about the range of Atelier Acrylic Inks, and I'm going to run through a few ways that I'm going to be using them actually in drawing and in preparing papers for drawing. We're going to look at the traditional methods of ink and wash, and using the inks on watercolour paper, and using them for stamping and stenciling and for accentuating texture in preparing papers for drawing. Working with ink is a really exciting art form, and the Atelier Acrylic Inks continue that tradition with the intense colours and the beautiful pigment that is pushed out with water. Just really exciting. I am going to continue using the original Atelier waterproof ink for certain areas in my art. With the original Atelier drawing ink, I had to be careful about where I placed it, because once it has another wet layer over top, it reactivates. So in this painting here, we can see the original marks have been blurred, which was intentional for the horizon, but the later use of the ink had to be on top and the last thing, so that it wasn't blurred with more water. These both were on mono printed paper, where the gesso and the ink are printed on the paper, and then dry media is used over the top, because dry media doesn't affect the ink base. And both of these are done with the original waterproof drawing ink on stretched watercolor paper over collage. You can see the collage underneath, and then both of them, this one was finished with just ink and this one was finished with pastel, graphite and charcoal. But the inks have opened up a whole world because of their acrylic nature. You can still use your ink in the traditional manner of ink wash. Here's a little drawing. This is just on regular cartridge paper. We'll just put out some ink on our palette, and using a nib, just beautiful work can be done with a nib. You can see the intense black in these beautiful lines. Using a liner brush, we can push beautiful ink swathes through here. You can see just how beautifully the ink is moving. And then we can use the traditional beautiful marks that are done with feather quills. After this is dried, we're going to show how the sepia ink is going to go over this, and everything is going to be beautifully in place and totally unmoved by the wet ink. Now I'm just going to cover this and splatter some ink with our brush. First we'll do it with a liner brush, get some really lovely dots of colour. It's important to be able to realise we have this beautiful freedom with this ink, and then we'll just get some fine splatters with the toothbrush. So all these beautiful splatters are going to remain totally unmoved by the wet sepia wash that we're going to come back to and use in this. The inks with their beautiful colours are fantastic. I've stretched a piece of watercolour paper here on a board so that it's going to remain beautiful and taut and still. And with my liner brush, I'm going to draw in some basic trees, full strength, and then I'm going to just use the water and the mist sprayer to bring some beautiful shadowy areas. Oh, this ink is just glorious. It is just flowing off the brush. This is all straight ink. We're just going to hit it with the mister and start to bring in some quinacridone magenta through the trees. I'm just using the side of the liner brush now because my intention is to bring in some lovely yellow sunlit sections. I'm trying to keep the magenta in a rough circle. We'll just hit that with the water. Oh, I hope you can see just how glorious this is. Now we're going to, we've got some phthalo turquoise, and I'm going to make some areas of sort of grass areas and push the ink around with the straw. Now I'm just going to get that feather and bring some of these. And what I'm hoping for is a beautiful feeling of a woodland. Now I'm just going to hit it with some quinacridone dots. And the last thing we're going to do with this one before we come back to it is hit it with some yellow. I'm going to push the yellow around with a very wet brush. So first I'm going to place it, then we just get an old very, very wet brush, and we're just going to spread that around. What it does is it retains just a really patchy sunlit feel. This ink is just going across the paper beautifully. That's a lovely start. We'll just I'll just soften some of the edges of that yellow before we leave it to dry. I like all these hard edges, I'm just softening some. Okay, so we're going to let that dry and we're going to come back in and show how beautifully we can place some more layers over that, and that's going to stay put. So when you're working on thin paper, ink is the ideal medium. If you're going to put a basis down for a drawing, you don't want to be using heavy paper all the time. And if you were to use your paints, the heaviness of the paint and the need for them to be wet in order for them to move makes them too wet for your thin papers and makes your paper go all wrinkly. Now these papers are all just straightforward cartridge paper. I've put some old tea bags and with binder medium, and I've placed some white tissue paper with gesso. What I need to do just to bring up the beautiful areas of texture, I'm going to get some heavy gel gloss, and I'm just going to add in a tiny bit of ink to colour that. We mix that in. Now this looks quite cloudy. That's because the gel is cloudy when wet, but it dries clear. So we're going to get a beautiful feel of that lovely sepia. See, that looks quite caramel, but that's going to dry with a lovely browner. So what I'm doing is I'm just joining these elements of collage on this beautiful thin drawing paper with a little bit of sepia mixed into the gel. And you can see it's such a beautiful dry way to add colour and texture to thin paint, and this is going to be a lovely piece of thin paper on which to finish your drawing. That's lovely. It's picked up all the texture and it's unified the elements of the collage. This one here is one that I've done previously, and you can see the areas where the medium and ink have dried to a beautiful dark intense colour, and I take these pieces of prepared paper with me to life drawing or out when I do some plein air drawing, and they're all ready just to work on. The other thing with thin papers is, and ink, this is a piece of paper that has been stenciled and stamped with the regular drawing ink. Now I can't go over this with any wet media. This piece of paper can only be finished with dry media, but what our inks do is they allow us to have just as much fun in preparing with stenciling and stamping our papers, but because they're so beautiful and thin, we just get a bit of straight, that is straight magenta ink. We'll just run it right through with a sponge. We're just going to run it right through the stencil, and we're going to have a lovely stencil that is so thin on this really thin cartridge paper. It's totally not affected or warped paper, but it's ready for more applications. Now, to do a stamping with the ink, you just roll the ink out with your roller. You just want to give it a little bit of water. So we roll the ink out, roll the ink over the stamp, making sure that the stamp is completely covered with the ink. Place your stamp on your thin paper and then print with pressure. And that's, you can see the difference. That's the ink stamp and that's a paint stamp. Absolutely beautiful softness that you can get with the ink. And not only does that thin transparency and the beauty of that ink work, but you can also use your white ink straight over top of charcoal and Conte and pastel. So this is a piece of very thin cartridge paper that's been washed in with charcoal and Conte, and I've started just to draw in a bit of trees, etc. So I just want to show you how beautifully with a liner brush you're going to be able to draw with your white ink. So this is the acrylic ink, and the thing is, I used to do this with the Atelier Free Flow, but the Free Flow is super opaque, and what this beautiful ink does is you can see it's drying, so it's not drying that stark white that the Free Flow dries, so it's much more of a harmonious effect. And once again, you can just see how beautifully it's just going straight over that charcoal and Conte. That's so exciting. With the beautiful transparent effects again of the inks, they're just made for glazing. So I'm just going to get another sponge. I'm going to glaze the yellow over firstly a collaged, this paper has been collaged and it's been masked with binder medium and it's been stamped with acrylic. And you can see it's got a really low grade orangey browny look. If we want to jazz that up, we just put the ink straight onto a sponge and we just bring that straight up through there. And once again, this paper is probably nearing the end of the ability to put any more wet media on it. Once again, it's just regular cartridge. If you wanted to do some work with glazing and paint, this is some pairs that have just been painted with regular Atelier acrylic, and we can just run a yellow ink glaze right over that. Then we can take it off where we don't want it while it's still wet. Clean that up, and you can see how it's just livened that right up. The other thing we can do, we can also just use that ink straight and paint beautiful intensity with beautiful thin application. Really exciting character of our inks. This is our first sort of traditional pen and wash, and I just want to put some sepia to give it a beautiful feeling of lovely old time effect. Now I'm going to use a wet brush. This is just regular cartridge paper, so I can't have too much water on this or the cartridge paper is going to buckle. But you can see all those splatters and all those ink marks are all staying perfectly in line. So I can just keep playing and playing and playing to my heart's content until this old station master comes alive. And you can see perfectly unblurred. The ink is beautiful for canvas work because acrylic ink, it acts exactly the same way as acrylic paint. So on a canvas you can build up the layers with the ink. So this drawing on canvas started as a very soft ink wash, and then the gradual layers over the texture, over the collage, became more straight ink, so that until the final drawing was done with the acrylic ink and a liner brush. Then the acrylic cerulean blue was washed over and the ink layer stayed completely stable. Okay, so when you're working on canvas, it's exactly the same. The ink is so beautiful. So what I'm doing, I'm going to put a layer of the phthalo turquoise right under the coastline. We're going to hit that with water. And then we're just going to push it around with our mop brush. That's just going straight over the acrylic paint. And then with the liner brush, I'm going to take some more of that ink straight up. With these beautiful lines here, I just want to run some ink lines up through the coast of this is Scott's Point. And then I'm going to leave this canvas so that the ink lines can drip down. So we're going to take it, the paint, if I did this with paint, the lines would lose the intensity, but because the ink is so thin, the lines come down really beautifully and they stay intense. You can see how gorgeously the ink has worked on the canvas. And as I showed you with the really large canvas, I can let these layers dry and I can keep coming back and I can make them as intense or as faded as I want. In Bush Morning, this whole work has been done with acrylic inks on a stretched piece of watercolor paper. The first layers were really soft watercolor ink, then it's gradually built up to more intensity using different sponges and brushes until finally the final end part of the drawing was placed using a brush and the full strength acrylic ink, and then little highlights were picked up with the white free flow. Now this is still wet over here, but what I want to do is I want to push some colour up through here. You can use your inks just like you can use watercolour, so depending on how much water you place on your brush. So this is just a regular mop brush, and I can run beautiful thin lines. This is all ink. Now I'm going to mix that beautiful phthalo turquoise with my yellow, and I'm going to get a lovely soft green, lots and lots of water, and run it all through here. most of the yellow has dried, so that green is going to just make a glaze over the yellow marks that have already been placed. So I hope you've seen how beautifully the ink works. It works wet, it works dry, it works traditionally, it can work contemporary, and it's just incredibly beautiful, staining colours, intense and gorgeous. Okay everyone, so this is how the sepia ink has dried with the impasto gel, and you can see this piece of paper is not wrinkled and it's just ready for a drawing. I hope you really enjoyed some of these techniques, and I hope you'll go out and play with these Atelier acrylic inks.